Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to the more than 400 people registered today from around the world. This is the second of the six-part series that AJU and the Middle East Forum are presenting on the impact of Middle East radicalism on American culture, politics, academia, media, and other aspects of U.S. society. Last Monday, we started with academia, and if you missed it, you can find that webinar on the AJU Facebook page. Next Monday, October 7th, we will have a session on the lessons from last October 7, and you can register for that webinar at aju.edu. Today, we're going to delve into Middle Eastern and foreign influence on U.S. politics and elections with national security experts Michael Pregent and Ryan Mauro. Michael Pregent is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and a visiting fellow at the Institute for the National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. He holds a master's degree from George Washington University and graduated from the U.S. Army Defense Language Institute. He's a former U.S. Army intelligence officer who has written widely on Iran, Iraq, and Syria in Foreign Affairs, the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Policy Magazine, and other publications, and he frequently appears as an analyst on BBC World News, Al Jazeera International, CNN, and Fox News. Ryan Mauro is a counter-extremism and national security specialist. He's an investigative researcher for Capital Research Center, focused on extremist groups and threats from foreign entities. He has a bachelor's degree in intelligence studies, a master's degree in political science, and a graduate certificate in Middle East studies, all from American Military University. His research trips have repeatedly brought him to Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, Turkey, and Israel. He's made over 2,000 appearances on media networks, both left and right, and been published or quoted by the New York Times, Washington Post, USA Today, and elsewhere. Let me just preface this presentation today by reading two sentences from one paragraph from a joint statement issued last month by the Director of National Intelligence, the FBI, and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agents of the U.S. government. Quoting now, the intelligence community has previously reported that Iran perceives this year's elections to be particularly consequential in terms of the impact they could have on its national security interests, increasing Tehran's inclination to try to shape the outcome. We have observed increasingly aggressive Iranian activity during this election cycle, specifically involving influence operations targeting the American public and cyber operations targeting presidential campaigns. That was August 19th, last month, that they issued that statement. I'm going to turn it over to Ryan first to give us a few minutes of his conclusions and analysis about the subject, and then I'll give Michael Pregent a chance to respond or amplify. Then we'll have a colloquy for the following period leading up to the end of the half hour, where we'll take your questions that you can put in the QA section at the bottom of your screen. So Ryan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to everyone who registered and is watching now, and everyone who's watching later on YouTube. So we're talking about the red, green, blue alliance. And obviously, a lot of people are talking about how countries like Iran and Islamic extremists and Russia, China, whoever, want to influence the presidential election. And we'll get into that. But I encourage everyone to think more long-term about, well, why are they doing that? But beyond just this initial election. And I think you'll reach a scary conclusion once you really analyze why they're doing this and how they're doing it. My conclusion is that they want to eventually neutralize the United States in terms of interfering within their own interests as they see them. If possible, seize the United States, which sounds crazy, but I'll explain how it's actually doable, and eventually destroy the Western style democracy, or at least make it inoperable, make it so it doesn't function. So, and therefore it doesn't appeal to anybody. And then theocrats and autocrats don't have as much opposition because people will look at America, which represents, constitutional democracy, and they'll say, you know what, doesn't work for today. Maybe work one day. I don't want it now. So those are the biggest objectives, and then everything else kind of falls under that. And there's 3 levels that they pursue this. The first level is the more overt level, where they support certain political groups in the United States. And I did a study of the groups that were protesting the DNC convention, and I found over 160 groups that were pro-terrorism that were involved in that. And I published that with the Capital Research Center where I work, and I study this stuff. And even though the protests of the DNC convention were just a gigantic fail, the network that was behind that still exists. They're still behind protests across the country. They're almost become like a singular entity consisting of Marxists, communists, anarchists by their own admission, and Islamist extremists. And then adjacent to that, you also have what some people call far right. I don't like the terms far left, far right, but you have to use them sometimes. That are more like white supremacist in nature, that get less attention on the conservative side, just like on the liberal side, their own militants get less attention. And altogether, they kind of form what I've been calling the seditionist movement because they fuel off each other. They hate each other, sometimes work together, sometimes hate each other less. Focus on Western Islamism. The Project of Middle East Forum is doing the best job by far of examining how Islamic extremists are gravitating towards the right side of the political spectrum. But then at the same time, we have this also longstanding trend of Islamic extremists aligning with Marxist type, anarchist type elements of the left, and when possible, the more conventional elements of the left. And right now, it seems like they're focused on the Abandon Harris movement. And according to their own calculations, as they state them, they have decided, the portion of the extremists that are in this network, that it is better for them to torpedo the Democratic Party's chances in the election by encouraging everyone to stay home, vote for Jill Stein, vote for Cornel West, essentially engage in self-harm. They understand that Trump is worse for them than Harris, but they don't view Harris as being that much better. And so their calculation is, if we sink the Democratic Party, then we can say, look, you need us. Whether you agree with us or not, whether you like us or not, if you want to win elections, we have the ability to direct voters in places like Minnesota and Michigan, and we basically control you. And then from there, there'll be elements on the right that see the same thing and say, well, let's reach out to those same groups if we can, because they control the country. You don't have to have majority support to control elections in America. You just have to be able to control enough to swing an election. So that's why I say it's possible for these extremist groups to actually seize the U.S. political process, because that's one way of doing it. As for actually destroying the constitutional democracy as we know it, which sounds apocalyptic, but if you look at what countries like China, Russia, that are on a different side of the spectrum, and then what Islamist extremists like Iran are doing, you'll know what I mean. The State Department just came out with a really fascinating report explaining all of the political influence operations and election influence operations of these different countries and the different tactics. And they include having bots, trolling conversations. If a conversation seems constructive that's related to their interests, inflame it, distract the conversation. Another tactic is they flood social media with either false information or even true information to divert conversations away from a certain topic. If the news isn't favorable to them, flood social media with another topic and get people talking about that. And the overall objective is to make it so, according to the State Department's conclusion, that there's so much disinformation, misinformation out there that basically it becomes impossible to have a civil dialogue, to have an intellectual form of the democratic process. And so you basically kill it by making it so dysfunctional and so difficult for people to know what is true and what is false, that you then gain the ability to direct political trends within the United States. You increase apathy, so people just kind of give up. You increase tribalism because people are so overwhelmed with information that they just kind of can only have the time to focus on what vindicates them, because that's what people gravitate to. And I can get into it, but there's all sorts of different tactics that the State Department says that these countries are engaging in. And over the long term, beyond just this election, I think they have the potential to be more destructive in a certain way than WMDs. Because if you can mess up the ability of America to have a healthy civil society, well, I don't know how you come back from that. I don't know how you fix it. So with that thought, I'll pass things over to Michael.
Or go ahead, Michael. Either amplify or go in a different direction. Whatever you think. You're on mute.
Yeah. Otherwise, you would have heard all the clatter in the background. Okay. So again, thanks for having me. Great to be on this, on this panel and in this discussion. What we have to really tell ourselves as Americans is that our adversaries, that our enemies, believe there are political outcomes that favor them. Our enemies actually believe that if a certain presidential candidate wins, it benefits them. And we can look at this election, we can see what left-leaning press says about our adversaries and who they want. And then right, I wouldn't even say right, I'd say center, to be honest with you. Center-leaning media will maybe it doesn't exist. All right, let's just call it right-leaning media. We'll say that our adversaries support this candidate. When it comes to Iran, we know that the regime does not want a second Trump administration, because if that happens, there'll be maximum pressure will go back in place, right? It'll cripple Iran's economy. What's interesting now is we're in this permissive environment ahead of a US election where our adversaries are going to get all they can. They're going to try to get all they can until November 5th without tilting the election in one way, meaning if there's a terrorist attack, it favors Trump, because Trump can say, look, at these bad policies from the Biden-Harris administration have led to our adversaries wanting to do things like this, conduct attacks. And we can look back at what Osama bin Laden said when George Bush ran for his second term, where he said, hey, listen, if you blue states don't vote for George Bush, you're going to be okay. But if you red states vote for George Bush, we're going to hit you. And Americans don't like being told how to vote by a terrorist group. Unfortunately, after October 7th, American attitudes, especially in our youth, influence in these pro-Hamas rallies, they basically have taken a sympathetic position when it comes to terrorism. We even heard them say that maybe Osama bin Laden was right. Remember that letter, Osama bin Laden's letter to the United States? And what that message says to a terrorist leader is, hey, maybe we could conduct an attack in the US and have 30% support for an attack based on, using these themes. We're going against the colonists, we're going against the racists, we're going against those who support genocide. And our idiot population believes that. And to Ryan's point, that's one of the biggest problems is our adversaries can get on Twitter or TikTok and say things, and there's a defense against that. Don't believe everything you read, and don't believe everything you hear. Find out for yourself, right? Look at the balance, and then we talk about disinformation and misinformation, and what that really means. When you apply it to the political prism that is the United States media, academia, and activists, disinformation is something they don't agree with. Misinformation is something that is effective that they don't agree with. And so we have this war of information. And I have more faith in Americans. And I think Ryan, we're going to be able to see after this election how many votes were the Democrats lost as they courted these violent extremists, as they courted these pro-Hamas positions in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Minnesota, Wisconsin, wherever they were focused on not losing the Arab vote. We're likely going to see they've lost the moderate independent vote. And I'm really looking forward to seeing those numbers because we've seen this effort in Washington, D.C., one of the silliest cities in the world when it comes to being effective. We've seen all this pressure put on Democrat politicians to support Hamas, and then we've seen the pushback from moderates and the pushback from the pro-Israel side saying, hey, wait a minute, you cannot support these positions. We just had the targeting of Nasrallah, and it's not necessarily a joke to offer condolences to Rashida Tlaib, to AOC, to Kamala Harris, to Jake Sullivan and Antony Blinken, as far as how far they've gone to court our country's enemies, especially when it comes to Iran. This affinity for the regime in Tehran by this administration, if we wanted to end a war that started on October 7th, we should have done it on October 8th. Instead, Hamas knew that they would have support in U.S. academia, the U.S. political system, and in these activist groups here in the United States. This is a terrorist group who knew they were going to have support the day after conducting one of the most horrific atrocities in modern time. And they knew they were going to have support. And we have to remember what the administration did the next day and why Iran is interfering in this election. The administration on October 8th said Iran was not involved. Iran had nothing to do with October 7th. Hamas is an Iranian proxy. The Houthis are an Iranian proxy. Hezbollah is an Iranian proxy. And this administration has done everything it can to tell Iran, don't, like you would tell a child not to go into the cookie jar with no repercussions. Don't. We have 200 attacks on U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria with no repercussions. It's easy to be an adversary of the United States because, unfortunately, if you do it right, you'll probably have 50% support from the American public that is an inch deep on what our enemies really want to do to this country.
Let me ask you both sort of a general question about this foreign influence, because it's not only Iran, but Russia too. Although you might think that Russia and Iran were supporting opposing candidates in this election, possibly. But my general question to you is what do we know? Because this was an issue in 2016, another issue in 2020, now another issue this election. How effective are these efforts, or do we have any hard data about their impact and influence? Because we're bombarded by social media, by texts, by 24/7 cable television. The universe of information out there is huge. And I'm just wondering if we have any hard information about not only what they're trying to do, but how effective they are.
Can I take it first and then leave it to Ryan for the hard information?
Sure.
I'll just say that Comey was more effective than Russia was in 2016. What he did ahead of that U.S. election by saying that they were looking at Hillary Clinton's emails, that was more effective than anything the Russians were doing. In 2020, Google was more effective than Russia. The censorship on YouTube, on Google, on Twitter, on Facebook was more effective than what Russia was doing. Now, today, I feel comforted by the fact that big tech, some of the most influential big tech people are not going to let questions being asked in 2020 go unanswered. They are going to insist on the media having curiosity about election, what do we want to call it? Election irregularities. All the American public ever wanted was curiosity by the press, instead of a narrative, uniform shutdown of any questions about anything. And I think having Elon Musk, and others like that to be able to say, we're not going to let that happen again, I think that's huge. And if you look at what Russia's doing, they're parodying Republican counter narratives to what Harris is saying. And the media is saying the Republicans are in bed with the Russians, when the Russians are simply saying what Republicans are saying. And at the end of the day, is Russia and Iran on the same side? I think that if you look at what the Biden administration did right after the invasion, after inviting Putin into the kitchen, but telling him not to go to the bedroom, they basically told Zelensky, you got 3 days to get out of there. There's a C-130 waiting for you to get you out of the country. Zelensky stayed and forced the West to be part of this. Remember, Trump shut down Nord Stream 2, not Nord Stream 2, right? And then Trump also provided lethal offensive weapons to Ukraine. So I'm concerned about what he'll do when it comes, Poland's very concerned. They're a NATO ally, and they're concerned that Trump's going to give Putin a win. So that's where you get the Putin supports Trump. But I don't know what that's going to be, but I'm telling you, those people that I know that will be part of the Trump administration will not take those positions. They will look for a strong U.S. response and position against Putin.
Brian, do we have any hard information about either the extent of the efforts by either Iran or Russia, or the effectiveness of those efforts, particularly as compared to 2020 and 2016? Because as Michael says, there were American media that was probably more effective, or the FBI more effective in its public statements.
There's very little information, and part of that is because you can't quantify a lot of this. Another reason it's so dangerous. So like 2016, the election was close. You could look at like maybe a dozen different things. What if Hillary spent more time in Wisconsin? The Comey certainly. A whole bunch, WikiLeaks, a whole bunch of different things that I think could have changed that election, or two of these. And, it's just so hard to figure that out when things are so close. The only hard data I've seen, I forget the exact numbers, was this relatively minor amount of money that was detected that the Internet Research Agency, that was Russia's front for spreading some disinformation, bought some Facebook ads. And it was, negligible, and that caused a lot of people to say, all right, well, this isn't really a thing. But that doesn't tell the whole story. If you look at other reports from Congress and the intelligence community, there was a lot more that they were doing in terms of bots and spreading out disinformation, stuff blatantly through their state-controlled media. That's just a lot harder to track. If you influence conversations of Americans in some way, that's certainly something you can't quantify. So it's hard to know. The sense I get is that they're still figuring a lot of this out. And as AI develops and as they get better at learning how to basically make it impossible for Americans to talk to each other, much less love one another despite disagreements, then they're going to really double down on it, because this stuff is pretty cheap. And the effect is, I think, considering how much they spend on it, it's a good investment from the perspective of evil. So yeah, it's really hard to say. And also we also don't know, although I'm more confident in our abilities based on what Israel's done to Hezbollah, you don't know what you don't know. So how much are we missing? We don't know.
Let me ask I'm going to turn to the questions from the audience, because there are some good ones here. I'm not going to get to them all because this is a half-hour program, but I'm going to hold us a little bit longer than a half hour to try to get to some of these questions. The first one is from an anonymous Zoom user who says, as a voter, how would I know if I've been targeted? What would it look like?
So the way I would answer that is say, just assume that you are. I think that with the realm of social media and how easy it is to do this type of stuff, assume that something you're sure about is factually incorrect or incomplete, because we're so bombarded with so much information. Well, let's not trick ourselves into thinking that any of us can sift through all of it and know what is true and what's false. I don't think that that's possible. But how can you detect it? I mean, that requires researching a lot of sources. And the problem with things like Twitter is that you get bombarded with sources. You can't research each of them. So I would say look for certain themes. Word usage will be similar, but coming from a bunch of different places. So far, most of what I've seen lacks nuance. It's like usually pretty extreme. And if it sounds hysterical, it sounds apocalyptic, it sounds sensational, someone's doing that for a reason. Whether it's just to get clicks and make money, maybe it's that. Or maybe you have a foreign government or extremist movement investing in it. But that's really the enemy of that. Core facts, and enjoying analyzing information like it's a giant puzzle piece. as opposed to just grabbing on to claims that reinforce your own opinion. That's the defense against this. Look at all of this. You just want to collect as many facts as possible. Look at it like a giant puzzle and enjoy that process and focus on it, rather than headlines, and just constantly ask yourselves, what is this, a data point or is this a description of a data point?
Let me ask a question from Bruce Portnoy. Do their tactics approach or exceed the standards defining domestic terrorism? If so, the Department of Justice and the FBI should be so advised. I'll just, before I turn it over to one of you, I'll just mention that the joint statement that was issued last month was a statement on behalf of the FBI, and the Department of Justice has indicted 3 Iranian nationals for activities on the internet trying to steal information from the campaign. So they are involved, but if one of you want to answer further to Bruce, go ahead.
Well, we need to look at how this could be weaponized against American opinions on social media and just people writing about things. We've seen the weaponization of speech, or the weaponization of the Justice Department to go after free speech. And now again, we have all these terms now: disinformation, misinformation. Look what Gavin Newsom just put in place in his state when it comes to free speech, and how they can go after and punish people that they label as providing bad information or disinformation, misinformation. Just to go back to the last question, how do you know? Just go look at one of your trusted sources and then see who they argue with the most and look at what they're saying. And somewhere in between is the truth, I guess. Just find a balance. Don't believe everything you read. Don't believe everything you see. Look for trusted sources and get out and see what your gut tells you. You can tell if the economy is good. You can tell if your neighborhood is secure. You can tell if there are more threats, if your police department's overwhelmed, if your government is unfocused. We have to remember the United States right now is so unfocused because we're in a presidential election cycle that this is exactly what Israel looked like on October 6th. They were fighting internally, they were distracted, and Hamas conducted an attack. We have to remember that there are cells operating in the United States that are looking at a permissive environment in which to conduct an attack. And the more we're confused and disorganized and going after each other based on, tweets or TikTok or whatever these politicians are saying in ads, the more likely it is that we suffer the consequences of that.
Let me ask it.
Go ahead. Can I just piggyback on that? Just some additional thoughts, real quick. One of the things I used to do was I'd be trying to find like a centrist or like what I consider to be a credible source, and obviously look for what you consider to be credible sources. I have found more benefit in purposely looking for blatantly right-wing and blatantly left-wing sources on the same topic, and also paying attention to what one side is covering that the other one isn't, and then seeing what crosses over and trying to reconcile it. Takes a little bit more time. You have to be disciplined about it, but having a healthy news diet and kind of going after it systematically that way, I think is good. I think if you look at who you're following on Twitter and Instagram, and estimate how many right-wing, left-wing sources you're following, and if it's 90% in one direction, you're kind of part of the problem. And do the same thing for those that you trust. So, for example, Candace Owens, who's obviously discredited herself in just a massive way just by what she says, but when her radicalization became open and first started, I was like, well, let me look at who she's following, because where's this information coming from? What bubble does she live in? And she was very, very pro-Russia, very anti-Ukraine. And I was like, all right, so let's see what sources on that topic she follows. There was one, the official account of the Russian president on Israel and the topic of Jews. It was like Norman Finkelstein and other Hamas supporters. And then over time, it grew to include more blatantly anti-Semitic, kind of like Holocaust denial type people. A complete absence of real expertise or any effort at balance. And so to me, I think that's a healthy habit. If there's a commentator that you like, I think makes good point stuff, make sure you look at who they're following on these and see if they're taking the step to give themselves a healthy news diet in addition to yourself.
We have an anonymous attendee who says, why is China not mentioned here? Aren't they more powerful than Russia and Iran combined? Do they have a dog in this race, to either of your knowledge?
No, we can focus on all three. You know, China is basically bankrolling Putin's war in Ukraine. China has invested heavily in Iran for their own infrastructure. I mean, everything they build inside of Iran is for Chinese use in the future. Just because we're talking about Iran and Russia doesn't mean we're not looking at China. China's pragmatic. China has a long game. China's big, and we can do things, you know, at the same time concurrently when it comes to China, Russia, and Iran. China's a huge economy, $20 trillion plus. Russia's a $1.8 trillion economy. Iran's a $400 billion economy. Let's take care of Russia and Iran, low-hanging fruit, and then take care of China when it comes to smart power, soft power, whatever you want to call it, economic sanctions. But we need strong diplomacy. And if you're China, you're happy with the Biden-Harris administration. If you're Russia, you're happy with the Biden-Harris administration. If you're Iran, you're begging that the Harris administration continues.
The two things I would add to that is that according to the State Department report that I mentioned before, in regards to China, what I found very interesting, well, and Iran for that matter, they said that Iran is paying influencers within Iran in order to amplify their narratives out to the world. But they said China is sponsoring influencers around the world to amplify their narratives. And there was a recent study or a report done that I saw that said, I think it was the majority of like Gen Z gets their news not from news sources or they get it from influencers. Like the guys whoever puts on the best dance videos or prank video is now their news anchor. And so China's realized that, and so they're sponsoring messages, which I didn't even know that you could do that for political and news content, sponsoring influencers. Very smart. There's a bunch of stuff that China's doing. China's connected to a lot of the pro-Hamas groups in the United States too, operating through different fronts. And then on the question of domestic terrorism, yeah, this disinformation stuff doesn't count as terrorism legally, but a lot of these pro-Hamas groups are, in my opinion, fit the dictionary definition and the legal definition for terrorist groups, because you have groups like Palestine Action US, now known as Unity of Fields, that are, you know, blatantly egging on fighting with police. If the police come to arrest you at a protest, you de-arrest. You forcibly attack the police and get them to let someone go. When groups are basically attacking ports and preventing shipments, that's economic sabotage. Property damage, when you riot, when you vandalize. I mean, all of that does fit under the banner of terrorism. It's just for various reasons people don't say it because it does. You think of 9/11 when you say terrorism, but all of this anything harming people, sabotaging the economy, destroying property, that all fits under the domestic terrorism rubric. And we've got a report through the employer that I work for, the Capital Research Center, coming out that's going to outline and call out some of these groups that qualify as terrorist groups. The best example being, and I'm sure most of the audience knows this, Students for Justice in Palestine, aside from egging on fighting with police by amplifying stories about it, they said, we don't only support Hamas. This is right after October 7th. We are part of the resistance, and the resistance that did the attack. That's Hamas. To me, that should change things, especially on the campuses, because it's no longer about free speech. Oh, I agree with Hamas. It's, I am part of Hamas. So you now have literally Hamas, in my opinion, literally Hamas on college campuses at that point, because what's it mean to be a member of a terrorist organization nowadays? Do you have to have a membership card? No, you just have to swear loyalty. They swore loyalty, so they're part of Hamas.
I am unfortunately going to have to end it here. This is a topic that obviously could use more than a half hour or the 35 minutes we've been able to give it to. We're going to miss some good questions from the audience, including G. Stewart, who said, what about Qatar and their money? To him, I would say, look, yes, and go look at last week's webinar with Neetu Arnold's 300-page study of the influence on American campuses, particularly of Qatar. And join us next week, please, and we'll continue the related discussion in this important topic that HAU and the Middle East Forum are covering. So thank you, Michael. Thank you, Ryan. Appreciate very much your contributions today.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.